In the late months of 1977, in a cluster of fishing villages along the Amazon River Delta, something began coming down from the sky at night. Witnesses described it as a light, but not the kind anyone recognized. A light that moved with intent. A light that could hover, dive, split apart into smaller lights, and then, according to dozens of independent accounts, descend low enough to touch a human body. People said it burned them. Some said it did worse. Within weeks, a region of quiet river communities in the state of Pará had a name for what was happening to them: chupa-chupa, the sucker, the thing that drinks. What followed wasn't dismissed as folklore. It triggered a real, classified military operation, one that Brazil's Air Force actually ran, actually documented, and actually decades later declassified. Hundreds of pages, dozens of photographs, testimony from soldiers, doctors, and civilians cross-referenced against each other with a level of consistency that still unsettles researchers who study it today. It's called Operação Prato, and it remains, by the sheer weight of its surviving evidence, the most thoroughly documented UFO case in Brazilian history. This is part one of that story. And by the end of it, you'll understand why the Air Force itself couldn't simply walk away from what its own men were witnessing. Colers is a small municipality on an island in the Bahia de Maranhão, in the Brazilian state of Pará, part of the vast water-threaded landscape where the Amazon River system meets the Atlantic. In 1977, its population was made up mostly of fishermen and small farmers, people whose lives ran on tides and harvests, not headlines. That's part of what makes this case so hard to dismiss outright. This wasn't a media-savvy town chasing attention. It was a scattering of remote riverside communities, many accessible only by boat in a country under military dictatorship during the height of the Cold War, a place with no obvious motive to manufacture a story this strange, and no easy way to coordinate one even if they'd wanted to. In the second half of 1977, residents across these communities began reporting the same thing, independently of each other, lights in the night sky, moving in ways no aircraft they knew could move, fast, then suddenly still, high, then dropping low over the tree line and the water. At first it was just something people talked about at the docks. Within weeks it became something people were afraid of. The stories escalated quickly and specifically. According to regional press coverage from the time, one of the most widely reported cases involved a pregnant woman named Sylvia Mara in the village of Mosqueiro, who was reportedly attacked by one of these descending lights, an incident serious enough that local newspapers at the safety of her pregnancy. Our case became one of the sparks that pushed the story from local rumor into regional news. She wasn't the only one. Local health workers began treating people for burns and puncture-like wounds that they struggled to explain through any conventional cause. Among them was Dr. Weleid Sesim Carvalho, who at the time directed Colares's local health unit and who, according to her own later accounts, treated a stream of patients that year describing the same experience, a beam or bolt of light making contact with their skin, followed by pain, burns, and in some retellings, drained, weakened states that resembled significant blood loss. That detail, the sense of being physically drained afterward, is where the phenomenon got its name. Locals began calling the lights chupa-chupa, loosely the sucker, because as the story spread, so did the specific, visceral detail of victims feeling like something had been taken from their bodies. Some accounts that circulated at the time were even more severe. describing a couple in Mosquito whose encounter was reported as one of the most traumatic experiences residents could recall from that entire year, though details of that specific case remain difficult to independently verify at this distance in time, and are treated in most retellings with appropriate caution. What's not in question is the pattern, dozens then dozens more, describing the same core experience in villages that had little contact with each other beyond river traffic, all within a matter of weeks. By late 1977, this was no longer a story contained to the villages themselves. Newspapers in the regional capital, Belém, picked it up, running headlines about the chupa-chupa, attacking residents of Parà's coastal communities, publishing interviews with victims, and in the process amplifying a fear that was already spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Panic is a real, physical thing in a small, isolated community. People stopped going out at night. Fishing routines built around dark, early hours were disrupted. Entire villages effectively went into lockdown once the sun went down, because whatever was happening, it seemed to happen after dark, over water, and without warning. Brazil, in 1977, was living under military rule. The Cold War was very much active, and the military held tight control over information, incidents, and anything that could be construed as a threat to public order or national security. A regional panic, serious enough to reach the newspapers of Belém, was serious enough to reach the desk of the Brazilian Air Force's regional command, the Comando Aéreo Regional, known as Comar. And so, in October of 1977, the military made a decision that, even in hindsight, remains remarkable. Instead of dismissing the reports, they sent people to investigate them directly on the ground in the villages themselves. The first military mission into Colares ran from October 20th through November 11th, 1977, nearly 3 weeks embedded directly in the affected communities. The mission's findings were compiled into a report authored by Sergeant João Flavio de Freitas Costa, one of the intelligence personnel sent into the field. What that report describes isn't a dismissal. It's a documented catalog of sightings, cross-referenced later against a separate, independently leaked chronology of events, with researchers finding an extraordinary rate of agreement between the two, dates, times, and descriptions lining up with a level of consistency researchers describe as close to total across hundreds of individual entries. According to accounts drawn from that period, the phenomenon didn't stay confined to Colares. As October turned to November, similar lights began appearing over Mosquito and moving toward the outskirts of Belém itself. No longer a story about one remote village, but a slow, visible spread toward a regional capital of hundreds of thousands of people. Military personnel on the ground weren't simply collecting second-hand reports anymore. As the weeks went on, some of them began describing what they were seeing with their own eyes, objects large enough to be described as a kind of mothership, releasing and retrieving smaller lights that behaved almost like probes, along with, according to some testimony gathered by the team, luminous humanoid figures reportedly seen emerging near where the lights had descended. This is the point where Upper Sao Prato stops being a story about frightened villagers and becomes a story about trained Air Force personnel sent specifically to debunk or explain a regional panic, instead documenting in official reports encounters they couldn't easily explain themselves. Leading this escalating investigation was an Air Force captain named Wairangam Bolivar Soares Nogueira de Holanda, the officer who would go on to give the mission its name, and whose personal journey through this case would eventually become one of the most talked about threads in all of Brazilian ufology. At the outset, by most accounts, Captain Hollanda approached the case with real skepticism, the professional posture of a military investigator sent to explain away a regional scare, not confirm it. According to his own later recollections, that skepticism didn't survive long once he was actually in the field. Within weeks of first-hand exposure to the sightings, the same lights, the same behavior, the same impossible movement his own men were reporting night after night, his position began to shift. By the time his team compiled their findings for the Estado Mayor da Aeronautica, Brazil's Air Force High Command, the operation had grown well beyond its original scope. What began as a short-term fact-finding mission stretched into additional operations continuing into 1978, generating a paper trail that would eventually include over 100 official sighting records, cross-referenced against hundreds more from leaked internal documents, an archive so extensive that Brazil would later become the only nation to fully declassify a military UFO investigation of this scale, now held in the country's National Archive. But here's where part one of this story has to end, right at the edge of the most contested chapter in the entire case, because Captain Holanda's official final report on Operação Prato said one thing, and what he would say 20 years later, breaking 2 decades of silence, said something else entirely. The Air Force's official position when Operação Prato quietly wound down was that there was no evidence of extraterrestrial activity in Colares. Case closed. Mission concluded. A regional panic investigated and resolved. Except the man who wrote that conclusion didn't believe it. Not fully, and not forever. In 1997, 2 decades after commanding the most documented UFO investigation in his country's history, Irangen Holanda broke his silence. And what he described, the encounters he said he personally witnessed, the reasons he came to believe the operation was shut down before it could finish what it started, and why he spent the rest of his life convinced that Colares had shown Brazil something the world still doesn't fully understand, is where we're headed next. In part 2, we'll cover Holanda's own testimony, the strange and abrupt way Operação Prato was officially ended, and what's actually inside the declassified documents that still make this the richest body of UFO evidence Brazil has ever produced. If this story has you already looking over your shoulder at the night sky, make sure you're subscribed because part 2 is coming, and it goes even further than this one did.